we're speaking on behalf of a co-sponsor of this initiative, Democracy for Development Institute. We're very grateful for being a part of the program in general, and then, of course, also being part of this speaker series. And we're grateful first to the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and also to the support provided by the United States Institute of Peace. So today, as was mentioned, I'll be discussing the international and U.S. role in Kosovo, and I'll be particularly focusing on support on democracy building, and particularly support from the U.S. So I have the luxury of presenting last, in the sense that I've benefited from listening to all the previous speakers, but they're also undoubtedly a tough act to follow. So I have that challenge as well. So briefly, I wanted to go with everyone through a basic agenda for today's talk. I'll begin with an overview of the international presence in Kosovo, as you can see there, and then I will concentrate on the U.S. role in particular, U.S. priorities on building Kosovo's state and democracy, and then I'll delve into U.S. democracy support to Kosovo in particular, and I'll make some regional comparisons, mainly comparisons to U.S. support for the Republic of Georgia. Finally, I will, based on my analysis, I'll recommend a complementary democracy promotion approach, and this will involve a role for the U.S. and the European Union. Okay, so first, these were mentioned. The international institutions that are present in Kosovo were mentioned in the prior talks as well. So please bear with me if I'm being at all repetitive. I want to do a quick roundup of the main international institutions in Kosovo, and as you can see, there's an abundance of acronyms and abbreviations, and I called it here an alphabet soup. So there's UNMIK, ICO, ULEX, and KFOR. Starting with UNMIK, the UN, or the United Nations mission in Kosovo, administered the territory in the immediate post-war period, and it fulfilled basically all the administrative roles that a state would fill in the absence of a state. UNMIK then developed Kosovo's self-governing capacities, namely it helped create what was called the Provisional Institutions of Self-Government, referred to as PISG, and this included the three branches of government. So it included the Assembly of Kosovo, the Government of Kosovo, and the judicial system. And importantly, these institutions, although they had self-governing capacities, they couldn't take any decisions that were related at all to Kosovo's political status, as this was undefined in the immediate post-war period. Then the office, overseeing these branches of government was the Office of the UN Secretary General's Special Representative. This was termed the SRSG, and the SRSG was sort of like the highest executive office in Kosovo. So, jokingly, this has been referred to as sort of the office of the dictator or supreme leader in post-war Kosovo. The United Nations, towards the middle, let's say, of its administration period, it led a negotiation process between the Kosovar leadership in Pristina and the Serbian leadership in Belgrade on deciding Kosovo's final political status. Would it be independent, autonomous, or something in the middle? The status process resulted in the Comprehensive Status Proposal, which is commonly referred to as the Ahtisaari Plan, and this recommended supervised independence for Kosovo. Martti Ahtisaari, for those of you who haven't heard of him, he's a former president of Finland, and he was the UN Special Envoy in this process. And he's also he won a Nobel Peace Prize because he's done work in several other conflict regions, such as Namibia, Aceh, and several other Southeast Asian regions. Moving along, the International Civilian Office was foreseen by the Ahtisaari Plan as the group which would oversee the plan's implementation post-independence. And it regularly reported to what was called a international steering group. This was made up of the 25 countries that basically recognized independence immediately and also recognized the Ahtisaari Plan. So following Kosovo's declaration of independence, UNMIK basically didn't have, it definitely didn't have the role it had prior, and had a very minimal role. It restricted and greatly narrowed its mission. I'll talk about how many staff members it had as well. And it gave way to the ULEX rule of law mission, which importantly took over under UN Security Resolution 1244. So ULEX was sort of a new mission with a different type of mandate, but it still had a mandate that was neutral to Kosovo's status. And as you would expect, this was pretty unpopular amongst the local Kosovar population. So nowadays, ULEX and KFOR are the most prominent institutions. ICO actually closed shop in September of 2012 after it completed its supervision of independence, and after the Ahtisaari plan was almost entirely implemented. And I'll mention that in my next slide. But ULEX's main roles is to support the customs, judiciary, and police sectors in the country. And this is towards, as was mentioned earlier, towards establishing the rule of law, cementing territorial integrity. As was mentioned in talks by previous speakers, Kosovo does not yet have control over the entirety of its territory, particularly the north of the country. And ULEX plays a role in supporting the Kosovo institutions into expanding on that part of the country. And they also help maintain stability in general throughout the country. NATO's KFOR mission, its main goal is to ensure public safety and order and contribute to the development of Kosovo. This is stated generally, but it primarily refers to the Kosovo Security Force, which is sort of the Kosovo army in waiting. And KFOR was initially composed of about 50,000 troops, which you can see there on the slide, and today only has about 5,000. And the largest contingents are from the US, Germany, Austria, and Italy. So I apologize for those who may find this basic, but maybe a worthwhile run through. And I'd be happy to field any questions on the particular institutions as we go forward. So as I mentioned, ICO closed shop in September 2012, and the Ahtisaari plan at that point was almost entirely implemented. And the sort of the values and the spirit of the Ahtisaari plan was also enshrined in the constitution. UNMIK now has a staff of about 400, and this is down from what used to be almost 9,000 in staff size. And the mission sort of remains in the country until a new UN Security Council deems otherwise. So this is not to say that it doesn't have an important role to play, but from a political standpoint, it's sort of unpopular for the Kosovar government to still have UNMIK present, and since they no longer have any sort of administrative role. And ULEX, which sort of took over a lot of the policing duties that were previously held by UNMIK, has also reduced its staff since its inception in the country, which is in 2008. It reduced its staff in police and customs, but not in the judiciary. And as you've heard in the other lectures as well, the judiciary remains one of the most complex and challenging sectors for Kosovo society. ULEX is set to remain in the country until 2014, and this is decided by the Kosovo Parliament. So this is something that's a matter of cooperation between Kosovo and the European Union, and it seemingly, at least I wouldn't be surprised if this deadline were extended even past 2014. KFOR, as mentioned earlier, it's reduced its size pretty considerably, and it's unofficially considered to remain in the country for another 5 years, so about until 2018. But this depends on several factors. This depends on the development of the Kosovo Security Force I mentioned, Kosovo-Serbia relations in general, and the protection of minority rights in the country. And KFOR is usually quick to say that it remains dedicated to Kosovo security, but sort of privately you'll hear that many of the contributing nations, the troop contributing nations, want to leave the country. They feel that the mission is done to a considerable extent. Okay, and now I wanted to move to particularly the U.S. presence and the U.S. role in state building and democracy. One of the most positive things about Kosovo, I would say, is that it's an example of joint US-EU enterprise. This is up to and including the period beyond independence. A senior UNMIK official stated that in the Western Balkans, nothing works without the US, and nothing works with the US alone. Of course, this may even be the case beyond this one region, and it most likely is. And here you can see in the last point, in U.S. foreign policy today, the Balkans is not necessarily a top priority and doesn't necessarily get the attention of policymakers in Washington. And this is based on basically a list of prevention priorities that's posted by the Council of Foreign Relations for 2013, I apologize. And you could think here to those who follow foreign policy about the bloody conflict in Syria, the Iran nuclear program, and balancing forces in the South China Sea as other things which are taking a lot of attention from policymakers. That being said, the U.S. is still committed and is involved in both KFOR and ULEX. In KFOR, the U.S. has exactly 773 troops, according to the KFOR website. This is the most of any member. This is slightly above Germany. The U.S. was a member of the International Steering Group, which oversaw the ICO. Again, that steering group, along with the ICO, has completed its mission. And this, by the way, is in a way a small point that they've completed their mission, but having in mind that state-building efforts usually take more than it's planned, it's more positive of a news story than is probably presented, that the ICO was able to conclude their mission in only 4 years. And ULEX also has staff contributions from the U.S., and importantly, this is the first time that the U.S. has participated in a ESDP mission, EU Common Security and Defense Policy mission abroad. And again, this goes back to the point of Kosovo being very much a joint US-EU enterprise, even more so than Bosnia, I would say. So these here are basically, I've outlined the U.S. priorities in relations with Kosovo. Now, just going through them briefly, this includes encouraging private sector growth, maintaining Kosovo's commitment to diversity, both ethnic and religious, creating a strong democratic society, with helping both the government and civil society towards this end, and lastly, supporting Kosovo and working with the EU to realize Kosovo's European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Now, I've highlighted there the 2 points that I'm mainly focusing on in this presentation, and that's again strengthening the rule of law and also strengthening a democratic society in general. So now I will move to talking about democracy support more specifically first globally and then to Kosovo in particular. And as I said earlier, I'll mention comparisons to the Republic of Georgia. So I try to stay region with KU Crease's regional perspective. So I first wanted to present a map here of U.S. funding for governing justly and democratically. And as you can see, this is spread across less developed countries in the world. And importantly, from these less developed countries, Kosovo is actually among the top 10. So even though it's not a foreign policy priority per se, it's top 10 in terms of governing justly and democratically funding. And if you think about this in per capita terms, according to my calculations, Kosovo actually receives more per capita funding in this regard than even Iraq, which is first on the list. Now, if you think about the type of war and conflict thereafter Iraq had, and the type of conflict that Kosovo had, that's it's quite astounding in a way. Next, I wanted to actually before I move on, as you can see on the rightmost column, you actually have a Freedom House rating for each of the countries, and you can see that basically in this Government Accountability GAO Government Accountability Office report, they wanted to see how much funding was going into. They wanted to sort of diversify funding or look at funding between free, not free, and partly free countries based on the Freedom House ratings. Okay, and I'll be concentrating on Kosovo, of course, but also I'll mention Russia and Georgia as well during this presentation. Okay, so breaking down this assistance, 50% of it that goes to Kosovo is actually for rule of law assistance. 31% goes to good governance, and 16% to civil society. So I'm going to argue later that this sort of funding from the U.S. Should be coordinated more with the EU in a way that allows the U.S. to fund civil society and political competition in greater proportions. So when I talk about where democracy promotion could come from in terms of the EU side, I think that'll make more sense. And we also see here that I've presented a country like Russia that receives most of its funding in civil society, and this is mainly due to funding government or governments such as Russia's being a contentious issue. Large countries usually don't like, large countries, whether they be democratic or undemocratic, usually don't like to invite international democracy support. It's sort of seen as a way of infringing on their democracy. And lastly, I added Pakistan here just to show another example of how funding is distributed. Here the overwhelming majority goes to good governance. And actually just mentioning, this is actually the disbursement of US aid funding. In Kosovo in particular, 97% of governing justly and democratically funding is then dispersed by US aid. And this is for the period 2006 to 2008. Okay, and this is funding for just the last year. So altogether, it's U.S. assistance totaled 85 million in 2011, and it actually declined thereafter. So it was less in 2012, and it's also projected to be less in 2013. And as you can see here, it's mainly focused. This funding is mainly focused on economic growth in Kosovo, and this has included economic planning, agriculture, and public-private partnerships. And the funding that goes to governing justly and democratically has focused on integrating minority programming into mainstream media outlets. It's focused on supporting the public justice sector and electoral reform. And in terms of electoral reform, it's meant working with the Central Election Commission, which is a government body overseeing elections. And basically, you can see here that support was mainly going to reforming public institutions. Okay, I don't know how familiar everyone is with the Freedom of the World map, but here you can see the Central and Eastern Europe and Russia region, and you can see basically that Georgia stands out below Russia as one of the sort of leaders in democracy in its immediate neighborhood. And in the Balkans, unfortunately, Kosovo, Albania, Bosnia, and Macedonia remain partly free. And unsurprisingly, these are the countries which are also further behind in their EU integration efforts. Okay, I don't know, that seems hard, that leftmost column seems hard to see, but this is a breakdown of Freedom House democracy scores. It's in their specific publication titled Nations in Transit. So as you can see on the far right, Russia's democracy has a score of 6.18. Now, the higher that score is, the worse the democracy rating is. I think the highest it goes is 7. And then it's followed by Kosovo, which has a better rating, 5.18, and Georgia, which has a rating of about 4.8. So from right to left, actually, Russia is considered a consolidated authoritarian regime, Kosovo a semi-consolidated authoritarian regime, and Georgia a transitional government or a hybrid regime. So all these countries scored poorly on national democratic governance, which basically means how inclusive policymaking in the country is, how good representation is. And then you can see that Russia and Kosovo have more challenges with corruption than Georgia has. And governing institution independence seems to be a challenge across the board. What you can see, though, which is interesting here, is that civil society is more developed relatively in Kosovo and Georgia than it is Russia. So we'll refer back to that. Okay, so Georgia, and this is looking at Georgia prior to and after the Rose Revolution. So prior to the Rose Revolution, basing this off of my research and my sources, Georgia was considered a weak state with an open democracy, whereas afterwards it was considered a strong state with a relatively less open democracy. So prior to the Rose Revolution in 2004, and as you can see, that Nations in Transit chart goes back to 2010, if that's, goes back to 2003, if that's easy to see. Georgia at this time was defined as a weak state. The country's institutions were considered corrupt. They also didn't have control over all their territory. So namely you had Abkhazia, Tsingali region or South Ossetia, and Najara that were outside of the government's purview. However, this government didn't constrict civil society or the media. And in this sense, those two sectors of the democracy were flourishing. And if you had followed what happened in the Rose Revolution, the latter took advantage of it. And then arguably it was a free environment for such opposition in the civil society and media that allowed for a revolution to take place in the first place. So if you see here, the Rose Revolution was in 2004, and since then civil society scores have not been improving all that much for Georgia, and neither have scores on the electoral process or independent media. However, the country has made strides in corruption, and I think that lends to the argument that it has sort of strengthened its state institutions, but it hasn't necessarily continued to open up or even maintain a free democracy. Institutions through free and fair election. However, they governed with the intent of creating a strong country thereafter, and not necessarily a strong democracy. And the Nations in Transit statistics, as we looked at just a slide ago, sort of attest to that. I'll quote here one of the studies I looked at for this presentation. During the next 3 years, this was the 3 years following the Rose Revolution, democracy in Georgia could have charitably been described as simply not a priority to the new Georgian government, which was intent on rooting out corruption, reforming the education system, restraining police, reducing bureaucracy, and strengthening the state. In concrete terms, this meant less media freedom, no independent judiciary, and weakening opposition parties in order to produce Georgia's fourth one-party system in less than 20 years. And the response in U.S. government support after the Rose Revolution was that it shifted away from democratic development, from its support to civil society and media, and it shifted towards relying on the government to carry out the goals of democratization. And this is sort of one of the main points that I want to bring up in my recommendations later, is that even though it was the democratizers that entered in government, it's not necessarily the democratizers that will continue to strengthen their country's democracy, especially if they don't think it's the main goal. They won't do it concurrently with strengthening the state. And in this sense, the U.S. may have benefited in its foreign policy from continuing to support civil society as strongly as it did prior to the Rose Revolution, to sort of maintain an atmosphere of political competition. And for those of you who followed Georgia, this actually led to the UNM government, which had led Georgia until very recently to be voted out of power, with the Georgian Dream Coalition coming into power, led by Bidzina Ivanishvili. Interestingly, even though we're talking about a regression in terms of Georgia's democracy, the recent election, just this past fall, was sort of a milestone, in a sense that it was a non-violent transfer of power, and you saw the government that had control of most of the institutions give that up to a new party coalition. So now I wanted to make that comparison for Kosovo, and I've termed it here a weak state with a semi-open democracy. I say weak state because Kosovo does not have control over all of its territory, and it faces lingering problems of corruption and organized crime, which have also seeped into the governing institutions. And its democracy is perhaps only semi-open. Problems lie in the independence of democratic institutions and in the lack of an influence in governance of non-state actors, such as civil society or media. So understandably, maybe this was more of a challenge for Kosovo in the sense that it had to deal with significant economic and development challenges following a war. But this is actually not too different from Georgia, which was also even termed a failed state in the 1990s. Okay, and just referring to this chart here, we see that the electoral process has not improved much. Civil society is considered relatively developed, although I'll argue that it's not as influential as it should be in policymaking. And then you can see that the scores in terms of institutions which should be independent are not too encouraging. So the independent media, that score is pretty poor, as is the judicial framework and independence. Okay, and last I wanted to talk about a sort of complementary role for the US and the EU in democracy promotion in Kosovo, but of course also to other countries in the region. So the US is actually considered to be a more bottom-up democracy promoter. In this sense, it focuses most of its energy on strengthening civil society, disadvantaged groups and political competitors. And as you can see there, it sort of goes that they support toppling the leader, pulling down a statue, and letting civil society take over. Of course, this is not in all cases. And I haven't mentioned the EU until now, but of course, the EU's democracy promotion is very important in this case because Kosovo is an aspiring EU member state. So in this sense, the governments of the region or any EU aspiring state has to cooperate with the EU institutions, meet the guidelines that the EU sets in order to reform and be rewarded on the road towards further integration. As you can see here, the goal of the EU has been to channel the post-communist European elites, mainly the elites in this Balkans and Eastern Europe region, channel their strong desire to join the EU into a grand project of state reconstruction and establish clear limits on domestic political behavior. Okay, so US democracy goals would benefit from continuing support of the civil society, political parties, and good elections, sort of continuing with its bottom-up emphasis. And this, but this alone isn't enough. We've seen even in examples in the region, such as Georgia, which I mentioned, and even Serbia, where the civil society became strong, came into power through some sort of revolution, but then once it was in government, it was helpless in terms of reforming state institutions. Oftentimes these civil society acts were dependent on the same political power brokers, oligarchs, or bureaucratic machines as those they had replaced. So concurrent to civil society support is necessarily at the level of government, and in this sense EU membership conditionality could promote good governance and could promote the sort of state-to-state cooperation. However, simply working with the political elite and not having a bottom-up emphasis creates a situation where political competitors are undermined and don't have a chance of challenging this elite in order to come into power, and this inadvertently leaves all of the sort of democracy and state-building efforts to the government, which has the majority of the resources and may not want to develop the democracy or develop the state, actually. Okay, and I wanted to conclude basically saying that a two-pronged approach for countries such as Kosovo and perhaps in the region is necessary. So considerable support, at least from the US, as you have seen in the prior slides, was focused on helping the Kosovo institutions, but I feel that in a way this could have placed too much trust on these institutions to be democratizers. And again, looking at Kosovo civil society, it's relatively developed, but it's not adequately influential, and media and other independent institutions are considerably influenced by political leaders. So in this respect, while the US, I feel that the US should continue to support of course state actors as well in its bilateral relations, also the non-state actors, while the EU and ULEX use their conditionality to bring the governing institutions along and make sure that they carry out priorities. Okay, and before I conclude, I wanted to mention a few caveats with my presentation. One is I relied on Freedom House ratings. Thankfully, they went along with my general argument, but many of you may not agree with the methodology. In a sense, this presentation is sort of a new hypothesis on Kosovo's democracy. So the regional examples are quite instructive, but I sort of attempted to develop this on my own, looking at support going to democracy and then comparing that to civil society and other and media non-state actors. And lastly, I just want to mention that the recommendations I made are more forward-looking, so they're not necessarily something that refer to the support up till now, but perhaps further on, especially as Kosovo continues to want to integrate into the EU, it may be beneficial to both the US and EU and Kosovo's development in general for them to sort of divide the course and one concentrate more on governance and the other on civil society. All right, thank you for your attention.
Gashi, thank you very much. My name is Bart Rickard. I'm also with KU Crease, and I'll be sort of walking us through some of the Q&A. I want to thank you in particular for taking the time to check in with our previous speakers. It seemed as if some of your concern was for overlap, and I want to tell you that you did a terrific job of sort of putting a lot of things into perspective and showing us how the EU and the United States fit into the picture that we've been sort of putting together at Kosovo. So I want to tell you that I've got a classroom here at University of Kansas. We've also got a classroom at Kansas State University. For those who are online, we welcome their questions and we'll be interjecting them. And also I'll be inviting students to come up and just give you their questions directly. I think I'll go ahead and go online if you I think you can see it in your chat screen, but we've got a question from Mark Wilcox. I'm sorry, from Mark Wilcox. And I'm having trouble actually reading it from here. Okay, so Mark Wilcox had a question for us regarding. He says, first of all, here at the Army Command and General Staff College, officers from Kosovo now attending intermediate level education courses with U.S. officers. They have a chance to live in a democratic society, observe how armed forces work in a democratic society. Notwithstanding your skepticism about the role of state actors in the democratization, how would you assess the U.S. use of such military education opportunities as a tool for developing Kosovo?
Interesting question. Unfortunately, I'm not too familiar with how the U.S. utilizes military education as a tool for developing Kosovo, but I want to mention in general that actually the security institutions in the country, be it the police or the Kosovo Security Force, are actually considered the most favorable to citizens. So, in a sense, it's not these institutions that where I had more, I guess, of my skepticism, but it was more for, I would say, the branches of government that are outside of the military, so mainly that deal with policy making in the sort of political realm, so either the government or the assembly. I'm not sure that answers his question, but...
I'll look for Mark to check back in with us if he wants to specify more. I think we'll go for that for now. I'm looking for questions in our audience here, and I think I've got one. Just a moment.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. My name is Sandra, and I was just wondering about the economic development, if you could touch on that a little bit, because I'm not sure how Kosovo will continue to develop after the international community leaves. I think agriculture and services are the top, like, economic contributors in Kosovo, and there's a large lignite deposit in Kosovo too, but apart from that, what will happen to Kosovo economically after the international community?
Yeah, thanks. Well, one of the greatest challenges prior to independence was can a new Kosovo state be economically sustainable? And you mentioned that Kosovo has great lignite reserves. I think it has the fifth highest coal reserves worldwide, not even in Europe. So in that sense, it's definitely a country that could be self-sustainable in terms of energy supply, which is not necessarily the case for the neighboring countries. But that's also a sector where Kosovo is expecting to or hoping to export energy to the region. Otherwise, agriculture is a sector that's underdeveloped, where definitely there are opportunities for at least improving employment. And lastly, there is some opportunity with tourism in the sense of Kosovo's mountains. It's a very mountainous country, similar to actually Georgia again, but sort of the ski resorts and that sort of tourism is also expected to be something that Kosovo can rely on in the future. But as you mentioned it right on, economic development is one of the biggest challenges, and this was a theme of the 50-year independence sort of articles and commentary for any of you that have gotten a chance to follow that. Unemployment is still pretty high. It's not expected to be as high, or it's not considered to be as high as it's reported, but it's still too high to allow for development. And basically, what the country needs to do is just to start producing, start making its own products and exporting. It's an import-based economy, and that's basically what's making it very difficult for it to be sustainable in the long term. And now the international institutions present in the country, whether it be UNDP or the EU, they're focusing more on economic development efforts. And even as you saw, the US is focusing more than half of its efforts on spurring private sector growth.
Mr. Gashi, I think I have another question from my KU class.
Mr. Gashi, thank you for the informative talk. I had a question regarding the title of your organization, Democracy for Development. What I mean by that is, kind of following on what Sandra said, if the economic situation doesn't improve, what we're seeing in a lot of different countries, Ukraine, Russia, Serbia, is that certain groups of people or percentage of people look elsewhere for answers, not to the political process, i.e. democracy, but perhaps to nationalism or to some form of religion. I just wonder if you see any of that happening in Kosovo, particularly among the young people. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, I want to start answering your question by referring to the points you made in the end. In Kosovo, it's evident that the lack of economic opportunity has made it so a lot of people have become more sort of nationalist, or have identified more with their national Albanian identity. And this has been the case for Albanians, but also Serbs in the country. The lack of opportunity has also made them cling more to their Serbian national identity. And also, the majority of Albanians have also embraced Islam more than they have sort of traditionally, and this is also seen to be sort of a result of economic helplessness. So I agree with you in the sense that this is the main perhaps this is the main area where Kosovo needs to develop. But our organization name, Democracy for Development, refers to the fact that even economic development has to come in a way that's inclusive and in a way that's ensures equity and ensures that the most people who need that sort of assistance get it, and that it doesn't go unfairly. I mean, one of the main economic challenges anywhere is the lack of property rights and the lack of the rule of law, and that's something that sort of that plagues Kosovo. And you noticed as well, perhaps in the presentation, that of course ULEX, but also U.S. funding and efforts goes mainly in the rule of law. So our argument is usually that if you have more independent institutions that could better gauge the situation in the country and better include sort of more actors and even civil society groups or lobbying groups, they could have a better sense of what the country needs in terms of economic development priorities. So in that sense, it's difficult to do one without the other. It's sort of as if you have to have a sort of a concurrent process where you go about developing economically in a way that's democratic and open to as many actors.
Actually, Mark Wilcox is online and asks about, he noticed that conspicuously absent from your comparisons using the Freedom House data were Serbia and Albania. He asked why you omitted them. What observations would you expect to draw if you had included them?
Okay. Well, Mark, I would say no particular reason for omitting Serbia or Albania. I particularly have more experience in Georgia, in the region, than in Serbia or Albania, even though, of course, from being here and being from here originally, I'm obviously closer to and follow the daily issues in Albania and Serbia. But if I had included them, the challenges would be similar. Serbia's main challenges lie in corruption and organized crime as well, and sort of the fact that they've taken over institutions. And similarly, that's also a challenge in Albania, and Albania also has a challenge with its electoral process. I would say a region-wide challenge, and in a sense, I think that democracy promotion could be looked at with a similar lens throughout the region, in the sense that institutions are very politicized, and maybe this is because we're talking about small countries where you have groupings, the clan structures or something similar, but institutions are usually very politicized in any sort of context, and that offers a challenge region-wide. And also you have weak outside actors influencing governments. So usually government has sort of weak influence from those opposing political competitors or civil society, and that's also something similar in the region.
I'm just waiting for other questions from the audience here. Okay. Colleagues at Kansas State, have any questions? We'd be glad to take them.
Happy you guys didn't have to deal with the snow day today, by the way.
Thank you, Drilon. I have a question about your expectations for the talks between Kosovo and Serbia coming up. I think they're this week or next week?
March 4th is the next, so it's next week.
Great. What are your expectations for those talks?
It's interesting. I mean, I feel, listening to Mr. Ivanovich's talk, I felt that he was a bit more pessimistic on the talks, and he stated, if I remember correctly, that the Kosovar side went into them only because their international partners asked them to, and Serbians likewise were very, the Serbian side was also likewise pressured. I don't know that that's the case. I mean, I feel that Serbia is very intent on becoming an EU member and receiving economic assistance, which comes with being further along on their integration path. And I think that was definitely a strong motivation for them to sit down with their counterparts in Pristina and continue forward. Also, the Kosovar side wants to get at solving the issue of integration in the north, and it feels that it's getting closer to that by sitting down with Belgrade, because currently the Serb population in the north only regards Belgrade as their political representatives and not Pristina. So I feel that there have been certain landmarks. The countries agreed on defining a boundary between them. Serbia doesn't agree to call it a border, but nonetheless it sort of divides the state lines between them. They've also decided not to. They decided to take part in regional and international conferences alongside one another, and that's not something that they were ready to do beforehand. So in a sense, I think it's been a very it's been a successful process, more successful than it was expected. But especially for the Kosovar side, they're weary that a lot of the issues could end up disrupting their territorial integrity and state order, and sort of giving in too much in terms of autonomy for the north could make their state dysfunctional. And especially from here, from Pristina, people have the Serb Republic, the Republika Srpska example very close to them, geographically and also in their minds, so that they try to avoid that at all costs. The last thing is, I think one critique I would have of the process is that it's expecting a lot of solutions very quickly. I mean, they're expecting accords to come in even next month, in March and in April. And I don't know, I think that's almost too quick for it to be sustainable in the long run. It's too quick to ensure that they can carry out and implement whatever they agree to.
I can see that someone's typing something in online, so I expect a question here in a moment. Just verification. Actually, I've got one more question in class, but I'll turn it over to him.
Hi, thank you again for your wonderful talk today. I just had a question regarding the rule of law programs in Kosovo. There's a lot of criticism in the United States now that a lot of our rule of law initiative type programs are trying to incorporate common law principles and civil law societies to the detriment of the court system, and in some countries they face kind of resistance from the judiciary. I was wondering if you could speak to that, if there is support for reform of the legal system, or anything along those lines that you could add.
Okay, sure. I'm not so familiar myself with the different legal systems, but I know that I guess I could speak to the kind of rule of law support that the U.S. is focused most so nowadays. Mostly it's focused on one of the biggest issues, I guess the two biggest issues in terms of the rule of law or an independent judiciary is one, political interference on the judiciary, and sort of corruption and organized crime, which could be the cause of that. And the second is the fact that there is a very slow legal processes and very sort of bureaucratic. And this ends up creating a lot of backlog, and it creates situations where people don't rely on the justice system to solve their problems. They otherwise solve them outside of the legal process, and sort of in this sense feel very disenfranchised and very very unreliant, I guess, on these institutions. And in this regard, the U.S. has supported instituting plea bargaining agreements. So making it so two parties in any sort of contentious case can agree on the issue without having to go to court, and in this sense reducing the backlog on the one side, and on the other side, the U.S. has continuously tried to put pressure on limiting judicial interference, and that's why you still have in Kosovo a lot of judicial boards and committees which have international members to sort of insulate that sort of interference in the interim, and create a situation in which their Kosovar counterparts could have the ability to take those decisions in full confidence and not be compromised in any way.
Thank you.
Our next question is online. Mark Wilcox asks, it appears that both Georgia and Kosovo, where the international law and conflict prevention failed, the OSCE and NATO were monitoring the Holbrooke-Milosevic agreements in Kosovo and the OSCE, and the UN both had on the ground presence in Georgia in 2008. So, what's your thoughts on that?
Sure. I guess I'll begin first with the more recent issue. I guess the issue most so in conflict prevention in Georgia was, I think Condoleezza Rice mentioned in her recent memoirs, it was sort of they were around the table. It may have been in the Situation Room in Washington, and some people were proposing that the U.S. should step in and support Georgia in its war against Russia, in a sense, or just to support them. And then it came to everyone that that would mean going to war against Russia. And in this sense, the sense that it could have been that large-scale conflict, I think it limited the individual military contributions of states, and it left it to the UN, which had to sort of jockey between Russia and between the US and the West. So, in that sense, I would say the UN was challenged, and it became more an issue of what the mission could do in the midst of very cool and obviously warring relations between Georgia and Russia. And referring back to the Holbrooke-Milosevic agreement, the earlier OSCE missions actually, what they did do was that they did accurately present the situation on the ground. So for everyone involved in the Kosovo conflict, going to war was, or bringing it to, going to war nationally, the KLA taking up arms, the Kosovo Liberation taking up arms, or inviting air raids by NATO was sort of a worse situation from the West's perspective and from the perspective of the Kosovars. But what international missions did in and around the period of the Holbrooke-Milosevic agreement was that they actually portrayed a pretty accurate sense of the situation on the ground, and they allowed for events to respond in kind. So I guess maybe I'm more of an optimist in this sense, but I don't think they were as much failures as they may have seemed.
I think on that optimistic note, we're going to leave it for today unless somebody has any more questions. Mr. Drilon, again, I want to thank you for taking the time to prepare this presentation and for speaking with us today. I also want to thank our colleagues over at the CKC for making this technically possible, as well as at Kansas State University for joining us for this series of talks. I want to remind everybody that they are available. The recorded video is going to be done on YouTube, both for KU Center for Russian and East European and Asian Studies, as well as for the CKC. Thank you very much.
Thank you.